So, it's really good to see you guys and to be here because I've been, excited to attend this conference since 3 years ago when Sub started talking about this. So, it's nice to be here and finally see it happening. So, as Javier said earlier, bugs are what we thought we told the computer to do versus what we actually told the computer to do. So, I'll be talking today about bugs and how to debug your apps. Some basic tips and tricks and certain things which would be helpful. But before we get to that, how many of you do debugging on a regular basis, just so that I can get a feel as to how things. And how many of you actually love debugging? Okay. So, the thing is, developing for iOS has become really complicated as time went on because, you have so many different platforms. First, you had iOS, then you have watchOS, and now there's tvOS. And then, you also have the different devices. You had the iPhone, the iPad, then Apple added the Apple Watch, and then now there's Apple TV. And, in addition to all of these, different things that you have to debug, you also have, apps versus extensions, where you have the extension running on the same device, and, sometimes you don't know how to debug the extension. So these things make debugging complicated as time goes on. So hopefully some of the tips and tricks that you will learn here will help you figure out how to debug, iOS apps. But first, a little bit of a history lesson. Now, this is the first bug. This is the first actual bug that, this was back in 1947 when they used, mainframe computers and, big computers. They used relays. One of the relays had this bug, in a relay short-circuiting the thing. So that is supposed to be the first actual bug. It is a bug. But the term, now, just to be clear, the term bug was used before that to indicate, a problem in code or with computers, but this was the first live bug. So now let's first get to the basics of debugging. These are before we get to how to debug with Xcode and stuff, I'd like to talk about a few things which are maybe common sense, but sometimes we all miss it because we get caught up in a bug and we are how do we fix this? And we keep on looking at looking at the code and try to figure things out instead of trying a few other tricks which might help you. Now, something that I always like about debugging is the KISS principle. Now, usually they say it's keep it simple, stupid, but I really like to think of it as keep it simple and smart. Try to do your instead of spending a lot of time on a problem and wasting time if you are not able to figure it out, try some other techniques which might help you to figure it out instead of just looking at the code itself. One thing that that we all hit as iOS developers is not testing on device. Since the simulator is so easy to develop with, we usually work on the simulator. And when we hit a bug and we keep on trying to figure out what's wrong. And sometimes it's just as simple as the bug is on the simulator, and if you test it on device, it's totally fine. And you realize that it's not a bug at all. It's just a simulator issue. Or at least a bug, not not a bug in device, it's a bug on the simulator. So, I've spent, hours literally sometimes, trying to figure out why something is going wrong. And then I'm like, duh. And then, because I test it on the device and the bug is not there at all. The other thing is, if you have a bug, don't spend a lot of time trying to figure it out yourself because, usually if you hit a bug, somebody else has hit the same issue somewhere else. And it's on the internet somewhere. So go on Google, do a search, and see whether it turns up any results. And if you're dealing with beta versions of Xcode or iOS, usually you will not find a lot of information on Google because Apple has NDAs and so on, and people are reluctant to talk, though some people do still post about it online. So you might want to try Apple's developer forums, where you will almost always find somebody talking about an issue in the beta code. Or if nobody is talking about it, you can post something on the forums, and usually an Apple engineer will come along and give you a solution, or at least let you know whether it's a known issue, and to file a radar or a bug report. Now, if none of these things help and you still don't know what is going wrong, version control systems can help you figure out what went wrong. Because if you are using a version control system like Git or Mercurial or something like that, and you are very conscientious about making committing to version control as you make changes, you can compare the current version of your source code against the version without a problem to see what lines of code changed. And it might be fairly obvious when you look at it, hey, this is what changed that made, that created this particular bug. Now, let me take a little, go off on a tangent here and talk a little bit about version control systems, because people are kind of hesitant to use version control systems because Git, etc. usually involves command line, working with the command line, and people don't want to remember commands, and they don't want to, use Git mostly because of that. But these days you have a lot of visual Git clients. Like I'm sorry if I'm talking mostly about Git because Git's what I use, but you have the same thing for Mercurial, for instance, if you're using Mercurial. So Xcode has built-in version source control functionality. So you can basically, check into Git and check, compare versions, see the changes, etc. from Xcode itself. If not, there are some other alternatives like SourceTree, GitHub, and GitHub Desktop. All are free, and they do a pretty good job in their own ways. Like, you can follow, use these links, go check out the clients if you're not using already, and that might help you get using version control much more than you do now if you don't, and that will help you figure out how your code might have changed. And the other thing which might help you debug program issues are crash logs. Now Apple has integrated crash logs into Xcode itself, so you can go in and see the crashes that other people have had with your app. And when you have crashes, you can see the crash reports as well. Like, for instance, Crashlytics. Now, Javier works for Twitter and he works on the Fabric team. So Fabric is where Crashlytics was folded into Fabric. And Crashlytics and Hockey app, they both are excellent. Like, I personally use Crashlytics. It's a very small library and it integrates into your app. And it'll show you so much of useful information, like the OS version, the device, the crash happened on, things like that, which might help you identify a particular bug. Because sometimes a bug doesn't happen at your end when you're trying to figure it out, but it happens on somebody else's device. In which case, it's very difficult to figure it out. But sometimes, seeing whether it happens only on iOS 7. Or iOS 8 or on a particular iOS version helps you figure it out, because you might have been testing on the latest iOS version and have not tested on the previous iOS versions. So crash logs can help. Now, the final tip I would have for you in the KISS class would be to pare things down. Like if you have a bug and if it is in a complicated project, you might not be able to figure out what's going wrong because it's all connected together. So the thing would be to cut out all functionality except for the bug. Try to isolate the bug into a smaller app. And just in trying to remove bits and pieces to bring isolate the bug, you might actually find where the bug is. And even if it didn't, the thing is, sometimes the work projects we do, we can't share with other people because there might be proprietary code, or your client does not want you to share the code. But if you cut it down into a smaller sample app, you can give it to somebody else and ask them to help you with the bug report, like with the debugging. So that way you can have a better approach to debugging it yourself, and also be able to share it with other people or post the project online so that somebody else can take a look and tell you what might be wrong. Now when we get to Xcode debugging, the basics are like the basic unit of debugging would be breakpoints. You can set breakpoints on a project, and you can see how stop at that particular line of code and see how execution flows. So let me run, I'm sure most of you are familiar with most of these techniques, but let me just start up this the demo app that we will be using later for doing some more complicated stuff. And I'll just show you some of the things quickly so that you can see how this would work for people who might not be familiar with this. This is a simple app that I've created for this session. It connects to this website called 10x10, which has images from news stories. It's based on keywords from current news stories. Of course, this is slightly out of date because these guys stopped updating about 2 months back. So the stories are not quite there, but this is the app we'll be using. It basically matches an image to a keyword, and that's what the app is all about. So a breakpoint simply would be where you can set a breakpoint like this, you tap on the margin, and you basically set a breakpoint on line 36. So let's say we run the app again, and execution stops at that particular point. But of course, you can also do things like you can edit a breakpoint, and you can add things to the breakpoint. Like for instance, you can set a condition so that the breakpoint. So because sometimes you might have code which fires multiple times in a loop or something like that. In which case, you don't want the breakpoint to hit the very first time. You might want it happening only on the third run or the fifth run. So you can set a condition where you can say, if you have a counter, you can say when the counter equals 5, or you can say when a variable changes value, or something like you can say when this variable is equal to this particular value, stop, execute the breakpoint. Otherwise, you don't do it. That way, you don't have to keep on coming to the breakpoint, telling it to continue on, and so on. Then there's watch points. Now, I'm really not sure whether watch points actually work on Xcode 7 because I couldn't get it to work the last time I tried with Swift. But basically, you can. Sometimes the issue is you have, let's say you display something on screen, but the value which is displayed on screen is different to what you expected, and you have no idea how the value got there because you don't think the code is supposed to do that. And looking at the code, you can't figure out where the value changes to some other value. A watch point can be set on a variable where each time the variable changes, the code will break so that you can figure out where things changed. So that's another way to do it. And then you have another fairly useful property of debugging is logging, because normally people, that's again something that people do basically to debug. They put log statements everywhere in their code so that it outputs values to the console. Now the problem is when you have log statements in your code itself, the same log statements will execute when you're running on when on the release version of the app as well. And this is a problem because it slows down execution, and it also fills up the console logs on the device and so on. So it's better to do logging on Xcode, similar to what I showed earlier about breakpoints and going to editing the breakpoint. When you edit the breakpoint, you can add an action where you can just you can log a message. And when you log like this, these logs appear only when you run with Xcode. On release versions, you don't have these log statements being generated, and that way you bypass the whole extra code in your project, and the reduced speed and so on due to the log statements being there. And another thing, like something that some of you might have experienced is when you have log statements in your code, sometimes a bug goes away. So if that is the case, do not take that as a fix, because that's basically because there's some sort of a timing issue, and the log statements are simply masking the actual issue. So it's better to remove the log statements, figure out what is actually causing the crash, instead of keeping the log statements in there just because hey, the code app now works. So now, oops. To get back to the okay, so now I think we covered some of this conditional breaks, how to set up conditions and stuff. So if you want, we can but we can do an example on the Xcode project, but then again, we've run through it, it's basically setting a condition so that you can break on a particular scenario. Now, threads. Threads are an interesting thing because thread debugging is one of the harder ways to debug things, because when you have multiple threads running in your application at the same time, you can't really set up breakpoints, because when you set up a breakpoint, you have other threads running in the background, and those threads keep running. And if the issue is due to two threads interacting, you are paused on one thread, the other thread is running, so the issue might not present itself. So in this case, again, one thing you can do is use log statements. You can just set up breakpoints which do because when you do breakpoints, you can tell the breakpoint that you do not there is this checkbox at the bottom which says automatically continue without pausing. The breakpoint will not stop, but it can log things and continue execution without stopping. So that way it's not the same as when you set up a breakpoint and execution stops on that particular line. So that way you can have logging from multiple threads to see what is going on, and you might be able to figure out what's going on because the logging statements indicate what's going on, like which thread is executing at which point and what is causing the issue. Now, the next thing would be views. Now, view debugging is another one of those interesting things where you might have some view which is supposed to appear on screen, but it does not. And you might be able to figure out what's happening by outputting statements about the current state of the view. You can output properties like is view hidden or the view rectangle, the positioning and things like that, just to see why the view is not appearing. But there's another way to do this as well, which is through the view debugger in Xcode. Now let's say your app is running. You can go onto the view debugger, and it lets you see a full hierarchy of the views on your app. And you can check where the views are. You can select views and see how they are positioned and so on. And this is, and there's a 3D view which will show you now I have to just figure out how to get to the 3D view, but basically it shows you how the views are layered so that if a view is hidden behind another view, you might be able to figure it out. But the problem with Xcode's view debugger is it's a bit crap. It sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. If you have a fairly huge app, it'll just use up a lot of memory and then it crashes and so on. So personally, oh, there we go. Now we get that working when I don't want it. So personally, I prefer a different app. It's called Reveal, which there are several apps like that. There's another one called Spark Inspect, I believe. These let you do the same thing that the View Debugger does, but they also let you do a bit more. Like, let me just fire up the Reveal app, just to give a quick demo. So as you see, it looks fairly similar to the Xcode View Debugger, but here the thing is, Xcode View Debugger, you can't isolate particular views. Here, you can just tap on a particular view and it'll isolate it for you, so that you can work with. Now I tapped on the label and it just went to that. Instead of which, let's say I want to see a particular cell, just to see the contents of that particular cell. So now you can just work with that particular view only, and then again on the right sidebar you will see that there are properties for the selected view. So you can change properties on the fly and see how it looks. Like you can change the background color, or you can change the positioning. You can change, you can check the auto layout constraints. So there are a lot of things you can do with the Reveal app which you can't with the Xcode View Debugger normally. So this tool can help you figure out things like why your views aren't appearing as they should, or why they are not the right size, or why your auto layout constraints are not working, things like that. So now the next thing would be auto layout constraint issues. Because sometimes you get things like, you get these weird messages on your console saying, auto layout broke for some reason. But the thing is, you have to figure out, based on the view names they give you. And the names are UI view, UI image view, and it will give you a constraint. So you have to hunt through everything to figure out what constraint it's talking about. But there are ways to debug this. So let me show you how you can do this, because you can add a ID to each of your constraints in Xcode. And if you add the ID, instead of giving you a fairly incomprehensible message about, this view, a UI image or a UI label and a UI view had a constraint conflict, it will tell you this particular ID had this constraint conflict, which makes it easier for you to go hunt down the particular auto layout constraint. But before we get to that, sorry, I think, yeah. But let me demo that along with a few other bugs which might help you see how debugging can be done. Like now, this was the working version of the app. So let me switch to a version which has bugs, lots of bugs. Okay, so we run the app, it crashes. So now the thing is, we don't know why it crashed. Sorry. We run it, it crashes, and it says exe bad instruction. That's all we know at the moment. Now the thing is, one place where you can get more information is down here in the debug area. Like if you switch the view to if you show the console will give you some information. Like here, if you look at it, it says app transport security has blocked a clear text HTTP resource. So basically, I have not, I'm accessing a normal, not a SSL URL, like a secured URL. I'm accessing a plain URL without encryption. And because of that, since iOS 9 has this functionality where it stops you from using insecure URLs in your apps. So if you want to disable this, like let's say for instance your server does not support HTTPS URLs, which is actually the case with this particular server. So then you have to enable that, but you wouldn't have known that was there unless you had looked at the console, because you just see a crash, and the crash does not tell you what is going on. It just says a crash occurred. So let me.
Presentation mode because it's a bit small.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I think it's more the code.
Yeah.
The font.
Yeah, like when I get busy at the moment, yeah. So let me switch the project over to. Yeah, let me just switch the screen resolution so that you can actually see what's going on rather than me trying to. That's better, right? Okay, so application. Okay, now I've forgotten what the key is. There is a key that you can enable in your project settings, which lets you override app transport security so that you don't have to have HTTPS links. Oh yeah, there we go. App transport security settings. Oh, I already had it. And you can go in and say allow arbitrary loads, yes, which turns off the requirement for HTTPS. So let's run it again. Okay, the app runs, but we have no images. So the question is why? Let's see whether we can try to figure out what's going on. Let's look at the console. Okay, the console is full of lots of things, but we are also getting something about constraints in this. Like there are lots of constraint issues. Now I can try to go through this and say, okay, this is a UI view and then it's an image view, so the constraints are somewhere in there kind of thing, and try to go into my storyboard and try to figure out where this constraint issue is. Or else, of course, looking at this, you immediately see that there are auto layout constraints, since there's a bit of a arbitrary thing that we set up. But in a normal situation, you might not be able to figure out what's going on this way. So then you can basically select your constraints. And if you see here, on the attributes inspector, if you select a constraint, there is an identifier field where you can set up the actual you can set up a name, this is label title height. So you can give it an identifier like title height. And we have a bug, which I did not plan for. So And it looks as if I have to file a bug report. So I don't know how far we can get with, because this is Xcode 7.1, which I have not used except for 2 days. So I'm not really sure what's going on. And it's an, let me see. It might just be that, this one, because since, now this is actually a pretty good situation where you can, there's a bug that I did not expect. And since the last change I made was adding an ID, that the thing to try would be removing the ID to see whether that removes the bug. So maybe Xcode 7.1 does not work with layout constraint IDs. So let's try that. And it compiles. So, so we found a bug in Xcode. So, oh no, we did not. So another thing that you might want to try, like when you run into issues, is basically clean your project, because sometimes you have, like when the project is compiled, sometimes there's debris left over from a previous version, and your new changes might not get integrated in totally. So sometimes these things happen where a project which has been working fine suddenly stops compiling. So let's try compiling, clean the project. Let's compile it again and see where it goes. Nope, we still have the bug. So that looks as if we might have to conclude this session at this point.
Can you remove the object over there?
Yeah.
The object we just added?
Yeah. Sorry?
Can you remove the object over there? The object.
Oh, the new object, which was, did I add an object? Okay, that might have been it. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay, that was it. Thank you.
And then you pull out the title height in there.
Yeah. Oh, incidentally, by the way, I forgot to say this at the beginning. Like, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and raise questions at any point instead of waiting for the end of the session, which is actually approaching pretty fast. So, so now let's try title height and see where we go. Okay, that compiles. Now just disregard the the messages about BOM storage, because that happens with Apple TV apps with images. I'm not really quite sure why, but that's how it is. And now if you notice here, the constraint does have title height there. So now this way you can identify your constraints by adding in identifiers. When there are identifiers for each of your constraints, you can see which constraints are involved in that particular auto layout issue. But in this particular case, we can, let me just remove the constraint which is causing the issues, because I added it in manually. Because I added the constraint in just to create these auto layout issues, but we still don't have any images. So what's going on? Now, so let's start with the basics. The images are supposed to load, but the images are not displaying. So let's see where we load the image, like set the images to the views, because that would be the first place to check to see why the images are not displaying. So that's in image view view controller. Let me remove that. We set the image here. So let's see whether that code actually gets executed. We set up a breakpoint, So we get to this point and we step through it. There is no image in the images object, which is where we load the image from. So why is there no image? So let's go backwards to where the images array is populated. It's populated here. So do we get to this point when we execute the code, or does it not get executed at all? So that would be the next thing to check. So as you notice, we do not load the image at all, or that code does not get executed at all. We come straight to the point where the images are loaded. So let's try working, like all of this happens in a loop. So let's go out of the loop and see whether we get to the point where, like, now we are basically calling a data, like, NS URL session, like, we are calling a URL to get the data, and then the data is passed, and the data is loaded into an array. That's I'm sorry if I'm glossing over the basics of this code, but I'll upload the project to GitHub if anybody is interested, and you can check it out to see what exactly happens. But basically the issue here is the images are not being loaded into the array which is supposed to contain the images. So let's see whether we can get to that point where, okay, we get to where the data is retrieved, and now we are checking for the URL list, and then we get an image path based on the base URL and the file name. Like, the other thing with Xcode debugging, you can basically hover over a variable and you can see the variable values. So here you see that the base URL is on the website and the file name is Francis. Now the thing is, if you look up here, I made a note based on the API documentation that the name has to be something.jpg. But here the image path is being created as .francis. So like if I look at the iPath value, it's this thing /Francis. There is no .jpg. So I apparently forgot to add the .jpg part, and which is why the image is not loading. So the other thing is, of course, you can look at the variables down here. These show the current variables in action, and that again will, like, rather than hovering over stuff, you can see that the variable iPath variable name here shows Francis, but no .jpg. So let's add the .jpg and see what happens. Okay, we got here, but we still do we have a breakpoint? Yeah, we have a breakpoint on loading the image, but it still is not loading. So why is it not loading at this point? Okay, now we have francis.jpg. Now we are calling for the image. Oh, okay. So now once the image is received, this code is supposed to be called, like, because we are loading the images in an operation queue. So like basically, like, in case people aren't familiar with operation queues, because in iOS when you can carry out certain actions by running through, adding them to what's called an operation queue, so that they will be executed in a particular sequence. Or you can have because, like, let's say you want to download, now this might download like 20-30 images. If you try to download all the images at the same time, you will be basically killing your internet pipe, because you are downloading 100 images at the same time on maybe it might be a dial-up connection or something similar to a dial-up connection. So you want to do the downloading in such a way that you use the available bandwidth in the most optimal way. So when you set up an image queue or an operation queue, it can download based on the available bandwidth or based on other criteria you specify. It can download either one image or two images in parallel, or maybe more images, depending on how things are set up. So that's basically what I've done in my code. It's downloading the images via an operation queue, and once each operation is completed, you can carry out and you can execute a closure. Whereas other actions are executed after the image is downloaded or after the operation, this particular operation is complete. So for some reason, the operation, the closure is not being executed, because here there's the completed block, and this part is not being executed. So why is it not? That is the next question that we'll have to figure out. So now, in order to see that, we have to go into the operation itself. So let's go into our image download class, which is the operation. It's an NS operation class. And like again, if you're not familiar with NS operations, basically NS operations run there's a main function which carries out the basic code to be executed when the operation runs. So I'm going to see what happens here. Now we simply ask for some data, which is the image, to be downloaded, and once it's downloaded, we because the data comes as NS data, which we create, we turn into an UI image, and then we create execute self done, which is the closure, like the part which is, because if you look down here, done, all it does is it checks whether you have a completed closure, and if there is a closure, it executes the closure. So why is this not working? Let's set up a breakpoint there and see what happens. We still don't get there. So somehow the image is the task does not run here in the. So why is this task not running? Let's go back to our original code where we set up the operation. And okay, now I've forgotten why this was supposed to not work. Yeah.
Asynchronous.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to call reload data after all the images are downloaded. So you're calling reload data maybe before images are being downloaded.
Yep, you're right. But the thing is, we aren't even getting to that point because the images are not being written. The image is not being loaded. So, like, you're right. That happens later, and there is a problem there. But at this point, the images are not even being downloaded for some reason. So what we are trying to figure out is why, because see, we add the operation to the queue, but the operation itself does not, the main function does not get executed as far as I can see. So the images are not being downloaded. So the question is, why aren't the images being downloaded? Now we see here we get to main, so that part is being called, but the data task with the completion handler here does not get executed at all, because the breakpoint does, because it should not get executed at this point, but once we continue on, that breakpoint should have been hit, but that breakpoint does not get hit at all. So okay, there we go. Now we basically what's happening is, as you said, that we are calling reload first. So because of that, it doesn't wait for, we've already loaded everything, but the image comes in later. This is what I was talking about earlier, like timing issues, because you try to reload images which are not there. So what you said was what's happening. It's just that we were hitting the other breakpoint first. The image is loading, but at that point the images have not been downloaded. So at this point the images are being downloaded. But because we have already called reload on the collection view, like to display the values, the images load after reload is called. And now it loads a bit by bit because when it refreshes, it loads a few of it, in portions. So let's go back and fix that part. We should probably call reload in here after the images have loaded. That would be one way to do it. It's a little inefficient because you're calling it every time a new image loads. But this will get things working at this particular point. And incidentally, another bug that you will see is not calling reload on the main thread, because this is happening on a separate thread. So here you have the images loading now totally, but let's say instead of doing this, I did it like this. I did not have the main thread calls. So because now if you notice the closure is actually executing on a background thread. So if you do it like this, well, now it loads. Okay. Yeah, so it could be that if I start fresh and the images are not cached, it might work. It might not work, but basically one thing to watch out for again is not doing things on the main when you're doing UI based actions like loading images or reloading views and stuff, and if you're working with multiple threads, remember to do the loading on the main thread, do the UI based actions on a main thread rather than on a background thread. So there's actually, we are running out of time. There's actually one more bug in this code that is fairly subtle but is there, which is if you look at the images, for instance, Obama is shown as Chinese. So I don't think Obama is Chinese, and so the images don't match the keywords. I think what I'll do is, because basically I can tell you what the bug is, but it might be a better idea to leave it as an exercise for you guys to figure out if any of you are willing to do that. So because it's to do with a logical error, that's what I'll say, because I made an assumption in how the code was set up, and that basically led to that particular bug. And so, if any of you want to talk about debugging or want to discuss your own bugs or whatever, you can contact me via email or on Twitter, because I'm always happy to discuss debugging with anybody and to help somebody debug any issues which have been bugging them. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed the talk.
We'll probably do 2 questions now.
Yeah, well, yeah, if anybody has questions, because I didn't think anybody had questions since I mentioned that you could ask, but if you do have questions, yeah, please feel.
Anyone with questions? Okay, so then thank you very much, Fahim.